All right, so we're moving on to 3.7, the section in Unit 3 about learning. And so the first aspect of, when we look at learning, we're going to see three major categories. We're going to talk about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then social learning, so environmental learning. So three sort of major areas of research in how people learn. And so when we start, we have to first sort of define what learning is. And just to reminder, we talked about this in memory because you have to have memory for learning. But learning is defined as basically a relevant, permanently exhibited change in our behavior due to an experience that we had. So we didn't know something, or we didn't exhibit a physical behavior until we had an experience, right, that taught us that. And then after that experience, we show that new change, and that change seems to be one that is permanent, one that is most often displayed by us. So this idea that, we can see that something has adjusted due to experience for long term, right? All right, so learning in psychology kind of happened accidentally, and we kind of talked about this already because I've shown you guys the video in class, right? But it starts off with a guy named Ivan Pavlov, and he's just a physiologist, right? Studying the drool response in dogs. And when he's doing this, he discovers that the dogs start drooling, right, before the food is introduced. And many of you see this in your household. The dog starts to notice when Pavlov comes into the lab, or when the sound is associated with sort of putting the food into the bowl, or as the researchers walk around the lab, the dog starts to produce drool ahead of the time, not when the food is in the actual mouth. And so this physiologist who's studying body responses such as drool realizes immediately that he has discovered learning in animals, that they have changed their behavior based on their experiences, and that behavior change is an example of them learning. And in this case, it would be the dogs drooling, not to the food in their mouth, but to the stimuli that is actually signaling that food is going to come, that there's an association, that these two events are going to occur together. That's associative learning, right? That two events are connected, and that if you see one thing, it's going to signal the other. And so the dogs know that when Pavlov walks in the room, that most likely that food is going to come. And so that drool response, even though the dog is not consciously choosing. And that's what's so sort of interesting about this classical conditioning that Pavlov found, this type of learning in which there is a reflex response, right? So there's like a physical response, and that's what Pavlov discovered. Now, Watson's going to add to what can be conditioned in classical conditioning, but at the beginning, Pavlov is literally teaching the dog a physical response that is not connected to its consciousness. It's not thinking, I need to start drooling. The body just starts to drool based on the learning that the dog has had. And in this case, the associative learning is, oh, here comes the noise of the can being opened, and that means that food is going to come. And many of you experience that in your household. Your dogs, our cats, are classically conditioned. They know the things that you do that's leading to the things that they love. So when they're being fed, they know when you go to the pantry or when you open that can, they exhibit the behavior that their expectation that food is going to come. And if they really love going on walks, when they see the leash, right, that might be also another signal to them. And you can see that classical conditioning where their body, right, has a physical response. Tag starts wagging, and they seem excited, right? Body heart rate goes up, obviously, in the dog. So this is classical conditioning, right? Something that is normally neutral, right, is going to now start to elicit a response. And Pavlov is going to start to study this. How many things, stimuli, can I introduce that the dog can learn is going to signal the food is going to come and that drool will be produced? So, he does a metronome, like a tuner. He does lights. And the thing that goes down in pop culture, the thing that everyone will remember with Pavlov's dog, is the bell. He actually uses a bell, and he rings it, then presents the food, and the dog starts to drool. This is classical conditioning. All right, when talking classical conditioning, we have to recognize the 5 elements of it. In AP Psych, they want you to be able to see an application of real world classical conditioning and be able to point out which things represent the different elements like unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. We're going to put these elements into a formula so that you see how classical conditioning works. But first, let's talk about them. The first one is unconditioned stimulus. And when we think of the word conditioned, I want you to think of the word learned. So it's a fancy word for learned. So unconditioned means unlearned. And in human behavior, we have 2 types. We have learned and unlearned. And unlearned means it's natural. It's like a reflex or something that occurs naturally without anything, right? And so an unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus is an environmental thing that elicits a response in humans, means that it is a stimulus that naturally causes humans to have a response, right? So getting punched in the face is going to naturally cause you to flinch, right? Or hearing a really loud bang that you don't know where it's coming from might cause you to flinch. Those things, that loud bang is an unconditioned stimulus, right? That being punched in the face is an unconditioned stimulus. Eating something bitter might cause you to have a wince in your face because it doesn't taste right. That bitter element is the unconditioned stimulus that elicits an automatic response. Now, the unconditioned response is one that's naturally occurring to the unconditioned stimulus, right? So all of those examples that I just gave you, the response the human did is natural to the unconditioned stimulus, so it's an unconditioned response. In Pavlov's dog, right? If we're looking at the very beginning of his studies, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, right? Because it naturally causes the dog to drool when it is in the dog's mouth. And so the unconditioned response would be the dog drooling to the food, and this is all natural and unlearned. Now, a neutral stimulus is something that doesn't actually elicit a response at all in the organism or animal or human, as we learn. And so the neutral stimulus that Pavlov had was things like him walking into the room or him opening the can of food or whatever it was to prepare food, probably not a can of food at that point in time in history. So a neutral stimulus doesn't naturally elicit a response, but it can be paired with an unconditioned stimulus and then trained to elicit a response in an animal. So in Pavlov's situation, when he started to study drool and like how he could elicit that response from other stimuli besides food, right? If he paired them together, he tried all kinds of things. He did a metronome, he did a bell, he did a light. So he would ring the bell, which is a neutral stimulus, doesn't elicit a response, and then pair it with an unconditioned stimulus, the food, and then the dog would drool. And then he would do that 10 times, right? But eventually, right, Pavlov would remove the food from the equation. So then he would just ring the bell, but since the dog had learned that the bell means food is coming, he found that the dog would drool to the bell alone. And this makes the bell now a conditioned stimulus, a neutral stimulus that has been repeatedly paired with that unconditioned stimulus, that food, and now elicits a response that it previously did not. So the bell once was neutral, did nothing for the dog. Now that it's been paired with food multiple times, now you can ring the bell by itself and the dog will drool. And of course, that drool that was once unconditioned, right? It was once a response only to the food. Now it's a conditioned response because it's happening to just the bell alone. And you test whether the dog has learned by removing the food from the equation and just ringing that neutral stimulus. And if that neutral stimulus now elicits the response, then you now have a conditioned stimulus and the response has become a conditioned response. And remember, the word conditioned means learned. So it's a learned stimulus. It's a learned response. So here you see the elements of the equation in pictures, right? If you start at the top left in Pavlov's experiment, you have the food, right, being presented to the dog, and the dog drools. You see the food is an unconditioned stimulus, or presented as US in the diagram, and the dog's drool is an unconditioned response, or presented as UR in the diagram. Remember, unconditioned means unlearned. It happens naturally. Then if you move to the top right, it shows that the tone, the little toner thing, is a neutral stimulus because when you ring it, it does nothing to the dog. No physical response is elicited. So it's just a neutral stimulus. But if you move down to the bottom left, you see the training or the conditioning happening. And in this training, it is important. The neutral stimulus must immediately be paired before the unconditioned stimulus. So if you're asking where is the neutral stimulus presented, it's presented immediately before you present the unconditioned stimulus. So you ring the toner, immediately present the food, and the dog drools. Now the dog's drool is still an unconditioned response during the training because we have the food present, that unconditioned stimulus. This is still the training part of the formula. But at the end, when we're testing whether the dog has acquired the learning or acquisition has occurred, right? We ring the toner, we have removed the food, and we look to see what the response is in the dog. And in this case, because the dog has associated the two events of the toner signaling, the sound of the tone signaling the food, right? The dog now drools at just the tone sound alone, and the dog has learned. Classical conditioning. Here is in a very strange way, right? Our book presents how one could actually be classically conditioned to feel romantic arousal, like the heartbeat and rush of romance, right? To something totally neutral and absolutely gross sounding, onion breath. And they put the equation in 3 levels for you. You have your unconditioned stimulus, your US, is the kiss that is given by the boyfriend. And then you see the unconditioned response is this heartbeat racing, this romantic arousal of the body, right? A physical response that is unlearned, is connected naturally, and so the unconditioned stimulus elicits the unconditioned response. But we introduce a neutral stimulus, onion breath. Onion breath alone does not elicit romantic arousal, but if we immediately pair onion breath right before the unconditioned stimulus of a kiss, we're going to still get the unconditioned response of romantic arousal, the heart rate racing. And if we did that enough, we could eventually remove the unconditioned stimulus and test to see if acquisition has occurred by just showing up with onion breath and then the person experiencing romantic arousal. The onion breath now becomes the conditioned or learned stimulus, and the romantic arousal becomes the conditioned response. Just so you know, there's a few things that are associated with classical conditioning that you also need to know. That's not just the elements of the formula, but some of these sort of terms that are associated with it. One of them is acquisition, and we already talked about it. Acquisition is the first example that the learning has occurred, right, and that the conditioned response is established in the organism. For this, you have to remove the unconditioned stimulus to test if acquisition has occurred. And so in Pavlov's dog, you ring the bell, you have removed the food, and you look to see what the response in the dog is. If the dog drools to just the bell alone, then we have learning, right? Acquisition. Now on the back end, if you just kept ringing that bell and you did not present food, eventually, right, that conditioned response will start to decrease and then disappear. And when it disappears, that is when extinction has occurred. So how do you get it to disappear? You expose the subject to the conditioned stimulus over and over and over and over and over again without ever pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus, and that response will start to decrease. So if you ring the bell hundreds of times without ever presenting the food again, that dog will stop drooling to the bell. It will no longer associate those two events. But there is something that we have to know about classical conditioning. This automatic learning, right, is out of our control, not in our consciousness. And so we are also subject to spontaneous recovery. If we've ever been classically conditioned to have a response, that response could just all of a sudden pop up without us being aware, right, that it's coming. So an example, if we were in a car and we got into a very bad wreck, right, which causes our heart rate to rush and feel in fear, we could immediately be classically conditioned to fear, to experience that heart rate rush when we enter the car again after that wreck. But if we enter the car over and over and over again without ever getting into a wreck, well, that heart rate, starting to increase when we get into the car will go away. Eventually, we won't have it. But one moment we could just get into the car days and days and days or years in the future and experience that sudden rush of fear and heart rate because we're in the car out of nowhere, spontaneous recovery. And obviously, if you're thinking in your mind and thinking ahead to disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder will be definitely connected to spontaneous recovery because the trauma and the physical response associated to the explosions and violence in war then can suddenly, after going away because you're in civilian life and there is no explosions and gunfire, can suddenly pop back up when there are holidays such as July 4th in which people shoot off fireworks. All right. One of the things that we found out through Watson was just generalization. This idea that you get trained to elicit a response by a certain stimulus, but then suddenly you generalize that learning to other stimuli that are similar. And so in this case, if Pavlov's dog had learned to drool to the bell, but you gave other variations, other tones, like an alarm from a cell phone or something that sounded like keys jingling, anything that was close to a bell, and the dog still drooled, then that would be generalizing the learning, meaning taking the learning from the specific stimulus, a certain bell tone, and that drool starting to occur to other variations of bells. You will see this with John B. Watson's study on little baby Albert, which we're going to talk about, in which baby Albert is going to generalize its fear from not just rats to other furry animals, so that it was trained to fear a certain stimulus, a white rat, but that fear was generalized to other things that look furry. And you can see this when people are classically conditioned to fear a dog after a dog bite. They generalize that fear not just to the dog that bit them, but to all the dogs, are all similar animals. Stimulus discrimination is different. This is if Pavlov's dog is trained to elicit a drool response to a specific type of bell, and that dog only drools to that specific bell and nothing else. That would be stimulus discrimination. So if you got bit by a dog as a child, but you were only afraid of the dog that bit you, not other dogs, that is stimulus discrimination. Okay, another really cool thing, because Pavlov kind of spent his whole life studying drool and learning, was this higher order conditioning. It's like, okay, we just conditioned the dog to drool to a bell, and we have removed the food from the stimulus. From the equation. There is no unconditioned stimulus in this equation. We are ringing the bell and we're getting the dog to drool. Can we teach the dog to drool to something new, a brand new conditioned stimulus, right? By using only our first conditioned stimulus to train it. So no food at all in the equation. So in this situation, right, we are going to introduce something new. And so let's pretend like it's a light. I should have a light there in front of the toner. So let's say a light, boom, comes on, and then we present the tone, which the dog has been trained to drool to, and the dog drools, right? If we do that over and over again, could we remove conditioned stimulus 1, the toner, and just present the light, doom, and cause the dog to drool? And if you do that, then that is higher order conditioning, where you have trained the dog a new conditioned response, which is still drooling, but you used the first conditioned stimulus to train a second conditioned stimulus. You never had the original unconditioned stimulus, which was food, back in the equation. Now you will know that the dog will always drool, have a drool response that is stronger to the first conditioned stimulus, the bell, than it will to the second one, the light. Because remember, it has a stronger association with food, associative learning, to the bell, because the bell was immediately trained with food, than it will with the light, because the light is once removed from the food, right? The light, you have to go light, bell, food, right, in the association, whereas it's bell, food. So obviously the first stimulus would have a stronger response. The second stimulus would have a weaker response. But still, if you're able to train the dog to respond to the second stimulus using the first, it is higher order conditioning. Oh, there's my light. That makes sense. Light, bell, drool, right? Then you remove the toner and you get your situation. All right, I think I told you about this guy, little baby Albert, right? I mean, John B. Watson, who studied little baby Albert. And John B. Watson was like, wow, Pavlov, this is cool. Classical conditioning is really cool. But what do we need to do? We've seen it work in animals. But when we're talking about the mind and behavior and trying to work on human conditions, John B. Watson wanted to see, does this apply, right? Does it apply to the humans? And also, what other behaviors can classic conditioning elicit? It's one thing to elicit a physical response, but can we elicit an actual emotion, right? Something that's cognitive? Can that be conditioned in humans as well? And so he removes little Albert, baby Albert, from a nursery, and he exposes him to stimuli, a dog, a rabbit, a monkey, a newspaper on fire, a rat. And little baby Albert shows nothing but curiosity, because babies have a few things that they are instinctively scared of, like spiders, but not all these other stimuli, especially these new things that are being introduced. So the baby's curious, maybe touches it, wants to see what it is, actually reaches out to the newspaper on fire, so doesn't understand that it should fear those things yet, right? And so baby Albert seems like a normal human. So Watson then decides, and he doesn't film this part, he decides to present a white rat to baby Albert, and behind his back clang a loud hammer against a steel bar, make a real loud, like gong type noise. And that, of course, would startle baby Albert and cause him to cry. So he uses the classical conditioning, right? The clanging is the unconditioned stimulus. The rat is the neutral stimulus. He presents the rat, makes the clanging noise, baby Albert cries. He does that 6 or 7 times. And then he removes the clanging from the equation, and he films it. He presents the rat to baby Albert, and baby Albert immediately starts to cry and try to get away, like baby Albert was doing when the clanging was present. Baby Albert has learned to associate its fear of the clanging with the presentation of the rat, right? It has made that association that the rat is signaling this loud clang, and now the baby is scared of the rat itself. Now, this was amazing, and John B. Watson had predicted this would happen. He was hoping it would happen, but he also was impressed to find out that baby Albert generalized that learning. Baby Albert was not just afraid of the rat, which is what he was trained on. Baby Albert also presented fear response to the rabbit, the dog, the monkey, and even a fur coat and a Santa Claus mask, which we all saw in the video. Looks pretty creepy. We don't really blame baby Albert. And then he returned baby Albert to the nursery, right? What didn't happen to baby Albert was counter conditioning. That would have been nice, right? The idea that you could actually use this classical conditioning, eliciting a new response, right, to a neutral stimulus. Well, like if there was something that was causing you fear, like a rat, well, what could you do for baby Albert? Well, you could introduce an unconditioned, relaxing stimulus, right, and pair it with the rat and cause a new response, like a happiness. So what should have happened after baby Albert was trained to fear a rat, right, was that Watson should have presented the rat and the mom together and keep doing that over and over again until eventually the baby started to connect the rat with mom and eventually not have the same fear response that it was once conditioned to have. So you could use it to kind of reverse, right? And we're using these, techniques in therapy. So when we're treating disorders, we use a lot of counter conditioning to eliminate disorders like phobias, anxiety, and even addictions. Now, this is kind of interesting. So we can use counter conditioning in a way to sort of make you have a nice, happier response to things that you once elicit fear to, but we can also create an unwanted response to things that you used to like. So what if we made you feel sort of nauseous to things that you were addicted to? Think food and drugs and alcohol. So here you see sort of this picture of it, right? The conditioned stimulus, a bunny causes little baby Albert to cry, right? The conditioned response. Cookies make the baby happy, right? So what we do, we take the conditioned stimulus, we pair it with the unconditioned happy stimulus, and the baby is happy. And eventually, if we do that enough times, the baby will be happy to the once conditioned fear. Right? Now, we talked about counter conditioning and we talked about how it could be used, right? And one of the things that John Garcia discovered was this taste aversion. Now, taste aversion is a psychological phenomenon and it looks like it's connected to survival, right? Where we immediately create a strong dislike or like an absolute avoidance of a specific food because it's been associated with nausea, feeling, or illness, even if it wasn't the food that caused it. So let's say we got the flu the same day we ate at our favorite restaurant, Cane's, right? And we immediately got throw up sick right after we ate the Cane's. Even though it was the flu that caused us to be throw up sick, we may immediately start to dislike or avoid Cane's forever. And we actually call this one trial conditioning, that the learning is the experience is so intense that the learning happens. I remember eating too much cornbread, literally as a child, and getting throw up sick. And I didn't get throw up sick because of the cornbread itself. I got throw up sick because I physically just ate too much that I could handle, and I never ever ate cornbread again until I was a really old adult, right? So the learning can happen after one experience. It's because that experience is so intense. And we actually think that maybe that's because we're biologically prepared for that we need to protect ourselves from things that cause us poisons and kill us. So we have an innate sort of evolutionary tendency to quickly learn taste aversions, right? So that we don't ever put something in our mouth again that could cause us that feeling or illness or kill us, right? And so we're biologically prepared to be taste aversive to things that we associate with sickness. And of course, you can think about how this can be applied to humans, right? If you don't want to smoke cigarettes, wouldn't it be awesome if they gave you something that they put on the cigarette that once you smoked it, right, it made you nauseous and sick, and therefore after one experience or a couple experience, but it'd be great if it'd be one experience, but maybe a couple experience, you associate the smoking with the feeling of illness, and therefore you stop the habit. Now they even try to do it with alcoholism, right? You could take a drug and put it in the alcohol, and so the alcoholic drinks the alcohol, but the drug makes them feel immediately nauseous, and hopefully over a period of time, or maybe hopefully one trial conditioning, if it was great, that alcoholic would then be aversive to alcohol and no longer drink it. Maybe even food, if you're eating really bad food, sweets, candies, things like that. You could think about how the applications occur. Now, there's a big issue with it. Humans have this cognitive ability that gets in the way of some of this unconscious sort of automatic training. So remember, classical conditioning is sort of out of our sort of conscious control. The experiences are shaping us and sort of having a physical reflex or emotional response. But in this case, that physical rejection, that physical rejection to the thing that's getting us, like the alcohol, the drug, right? It is possible that our cognition could say it's not the alcohol that's making me sick, it's the drug, right? That I'm not never going to drink again because I know that it's a drug, not the alcohol. So that's a issue with it. But it did definitely work in animals. They used it in places where national parks were out west, where they were establishing safe grounds, sanctuaries for wolves, but the wolves were going onto the ranches that bordered the park and eating sheep. So what they did was they laced the sheep with this drug that made the wolves sick, and they laid them out all over the borders of this area. And when the wolves consumed those sheep carcasses, they got ill, and they developed a taste aversion so much to the sheep that they actually would run away from the sheep if you put them in the same pen. All right, last but not least is habituation. In learning, right, there is a decrease in our sort of response to something, our learning, if we're constantly exposed to it. That could be a stimuli like a sound, like an airplane going over our apartment over and over again. We eventually no longer sort of recognize it, or a train going by our house. Or for learning purposes, in infants who can't speak, right? They can't communicate to us. We actually know that they have learned, or they are, They understand or they're ready for something new when they no longer look or gaze at a brand new object, right? So if we introduce a brand new toy and the child is obviously, entertained, we know that because there's no crying, right? No needing to be held. The child is looking at the toy, but we also know that once the child is no longer interested, right? It has learned it. It will move its eyes away from the toy, and that is that decreased response, that habituation to it, so that you learn. And just think about yourself in class. If you have already learned a subject, right, and they review it, and you've already gotten like 100 on the subject, and you're looking around wondering why the other kids in the classroom need review, when that teacher's going over that material in a full review, you're going to have very little response to it. You may daydream because you've already been exposed to it and understand it. All right, that was classical conditioning. That was a lot. I'll see you next time for operant.